Peace to the saints. It's actually about 2 a.m. where I am, but I wanted to speak on this because you will find a lot of misinformation as to why the president of Haiti was assassinated. And you'll often hear explanations without historical context, which is critically important anytime we talk politics, but particularly in the case of Haiti. And I happen to have researched Haiti extensively. I even put out a paper on leadership in Haiti several years ago, and I'm looking over my notes. But first, if you don't know what happened, let me briefly let you know that the current sitting president of Haiti was murdered in his home by gunmen, trained killers, perhaps mercenaries. And in this case, there are claims that these killers were speaking English with an American accent and or Spanish. It's worth noting that if you've traveled internationally at any level, you'll find that the American English accent is presently the preferred accent. It's most common, so that doesn't really tell much. And the Spanish accent could be an accusation that the Dominicans, who are right next door, could have done it. But none of that really matters. The question of, which group of people carried this out, it doesn't matter. The bigger question is, why was this possible? And why has this been a recurring thing in Haitian history? I'm looking at a paper that I wrote, I believe in 2011. And this is a paper about Francois Duvalier, also known as Papa Doc. And he's a unique figure in Haitian history because he is actually the person who institutionalized the Haitian government, which is to say, before him, Haitian leaders were being killed left and right. Revolution was going on and on and on. He was the first person to bring order to Haiti. And the reason that's important is because anytime you bring order to a lawless land, you often have to utilize something called violence. And people pretend as though violence is unwarranted. But when a government exercises violence using the instrumentality of the policing force or the army, that's actually called restoring order, rightfully so. When the government fails to have a monopoly on violence, meaning your government is stronger than the local street gangs, your government is stronger than the militias, if that's not the case, then you're going to live in a very dangerous place, which is Haiti today. And you should be asking yourself, how is it that a country whose per capita income is less than $10,000, meaning the average family makes less than $10,000 per year, how is it that they have so many weapons roaming through the streets? How is it that they're on the island of Hispaniola, sharing that island with the Dominican Republic, and the Dominican Republic has a much higher per capita income? Well, there are critical understandings that you must have of the history to get a sense of why this is the case and what must be done for the Haitian nation state to survive. Now, the truth is that this assassination of the current president is not anything that should sadden or surprise you. In fact, it's absolutely predictable, and it's very much so in line with Haitian history. But a quick note on the former president, I say former because they got him up out of here, but Jovenel Moïse was assassinated appears to be in his home, and his wife apparently caught a little bit of stray gunfire from these hired killers, or shall I say professional killers, and she's been hospitalized. The reason that you'll hear the popular media identifying for his demise, assassination, murder, what have you, is because supposedly he turned into a dictator. Now, mind you, any dictator worth their title is able to protect themselves, meaning they've appropriately monopolized violence and marginalized or incarcerated or murdered their opposition. Clearly, he had not done that effectively. Further, elections were delayed in part because of COVID-19, in part because there was not stability in the country. You can't really have any kind of election, especially not a proper democratic election, when you're having such high levels of instability in the country. Lastly, people who have an understanding of how nation states develop over time, you know that you don't just have a democracy out of nowhere. You cannot take a people who are largely uneducated, largely unaccustomed to the freedoms of democracy, You can't take a country where you do not have a solid middle class and all of a sudden give them the right to vote and think that that's going to solve the problems when the country still is going to have a depressed economy. The truth is, most times you see violence break out, it's not because the vote doesn't exist, it's because of poverty. That's the issue. And when you have a nation state like Haiti, where there's perpetual poverty for decades and damn near centuries, then you have to have a government which monopolizes violence, exercises it ruthlessly, and you can't have a four-year president. You can't even have a two-term president, which would be 8 years by the American system, because that is not enough time to repair the broken bones of the Haitian nation state. You need someone who has a long-term plan and who can execute it during their presidency and perhaps using the instrumentality of the party. So that is something we really have to be realistic about, knowing that even if you look at the European nation states, they didn't just become democratic. They started out autocratic as monarchies, right? Being led by a king or a queen. Then eventually the king or queen gave way to rulership by the merchant class and oligopoly, meaning, the moneyed and propertied class. Or it gave way to a dictatorship, right? Like if you look at Germany, you had the Kaiser, which was like a monarch. And when the Kaiser got knocked out of there, they tried to have a democracy. Germany wasn't ready for a democracy, and then they ended up with a dictator. Why? Because a dictator is autocratic ruled by a single strongman. And that was, you can't go from a king or a Kaiser to a democracy. You go from a king or a Kaiser to a dictator. You go from a dictator to an oligopoly. You go from an oligopoly to a democracy. You have to have a progression of these things. You're going to have trouble doing that when people have not exercised self-rule, meaning the Haitians, which is a black country, being ruled by themselves. If you look at the history of Haiti, it was initially colonized by the French, right? Then once the French got knocked out of there, you saw the Americans step in via the Marines. Then the Americans stepped out of there. You saw recurrent revolution because the Haitians were not able to monopolize violence and take over power over the country through a strong government that was funded well enough to at least have weapons that were superior to the militias that were roaming around. And also, obviously, you had incursions from the Dominican Republic, which shares the island of Hispaniola. But let me point out a few historical things you need to know about Haiti if you want to understand what is next for Haiti. And I'm just making a few notes from a paper that I wrote, an academic paper. And this paper was about Francois Duvalier, also known as Papa Doc, a historical figure who's really a legend and is like really understudied, and he's not accurately reported on. So his name is Francois Duvalier, and he's been characterized as an evil black tyrant, of course. And the reason that he's called Papa Doc is because he started his career as a physician, going through Haiti treating malaria among the peasant class, which was largely most of what Haiti is, right? Because it's an agrarian society, meaning that they still have not properly industrialized. You have a lot of people engaging in rural life and farming and things like that. Anyways, to offer a truer picture of Papa Doc or Francois Duvalier, you have to understand that he's important because he's the leader that earned the world's first black republic their sovereignty. By sovereignty, I mean self-rule. That means that the Haitians were being ruled by themselves rather than the French or the Americans or the Dominican Republic or any foreign power. He was the first leader of Haiti to have full control of that nation state. And what I argued in my paper was that his methods to secure power were absolutely legitimate and necessary, meaning violence. He organized a group called the Tonton Macoute. And the Tonton Macoute were like essentially cats who were walking around with machetes, just bodying everything that did not agree with this new government. Now, if the president who was just bodied or assassinated, if Jovenel had his own Tonton Macoute, he wouldn't have this issue, right? He might still be alive, because what you're not seeing in the news is the idea that, okay, the gentleman was murdered and they tried to body his wife perhaps, or they just accidentally hit her with some strays. It's really grimy. But he clearly did not have a proper presidential guard to deal with this invading force, right? So that's problem number one. That's like obviously suspicious, which lets you know that maybe at some level, the people who are supposed to be protecting him, whether it was the soldiers, the policing force, or the Secret Service, whomever, they weren't doing their job, or they were collaborating with the people who were overthrowing, or they were scared or underfunded, who knows? Further, it was said that this man was a dictator. Well, he'd barely gone more than 2 years over his elected term, and obviously we had a pandemic, and there was a lot of instability in the country. You cannot have a proper election when there's violent mobs roaming the country and intimidating voters. It's just not going to work. Further, it was reported that one of the complaints of the Haitian people, and perhaps certain political factions that are funded by foreigners, one of their complaints was that he was trying to organize an intelligence force within the country, like something akin to the FBI. Well, here's the thing. Every nation has an intelligence service. The FBI is a domestic intelligence service. The CIA is our international intelligence service. They gather information on foreign governments and their actions and try to give advantage to America and its leaders. So he had every right to try to create that. When you hear the Western media speak about him organizing an intelligence apparatus as though it's unusual or atypical, that's quite strange, because this is what every government does. And the truth is, each government has the right to protect its own power. That is, to protect the government from being overthrown by domestic forces or foreign operatives. Now, carrying on. So I say, because of this right here, meaning this assassination that just occurred, this is why when I wrote this paper like damn near a decade ago, a decade ago, I said Francois Duvalier was wise to have the Tonton Macu. He was wise to be very vicious in maintaining his power, because historically, in that nation state, most of the heads of state were very short-lived. They didn't die of natural causes, and they did not serve out full terms. He was one of the first. And further, because he was able to enjoy leadership of Haiti until he died of natural causes, he was the first person to institutionalize the idea of self-government in Haiti, because no one else had been able to successfully secure their own power. Consider this. How is it that you're the president of Haiti, but you can't even stay in office without the Americans sending Marines to protect you? You have to have a foreign government protect you? There was another Haitian leader named Aristides, and he had to be flown out in a chopper, rescued by the power of America just to stay alive. So that lets you know, we got to be honest, Haiti's a wild place. It's a jungle, and within a jungle, only animals survive. Carry on. One thing I want to point out about Francois Duvalier is that he was supported by a wide coalition of Haitians. Today, you hear the West portray him as a vicious dictator. Okay, it's lagging? Oh, that's a shame. Okay, let me know if the video's good. I heard some people say it's lagging. Let me know if we're good to go. Okay, we're good. All right, great. Fantastic. So one thing to know about Francois Duvalier, though the media portrays him to be a very wicked, evil person, the truth is that during the time that he took power, he was very well respected among Haitians and was supported by scholars, soldiers, priests, politicians, nationalists, and others, which is why he was able to get into office and able to stay in office for so long. What you should understand is because during the time that he ruled Haiti, he was coming into leadership during a time of tremendous amounts of racism. You got to remember, the French ruled These were foreigners ruling Haiti. Then the Americans ruled, and when they left Haiti, they put the mulattoes in charge. So imagine when you're in a country where 90% of the population is noir or black African by race, and you've put the pale-skinned Creoles in power so that they can reflect the racial hierarchy of the United States of America. That's what was done. And so Duvalier was one of the first authentic figures to come from among the Haitian people and be actually respected by the populace. What you should understand is the reason he couldn't be taken out in the same way that the quote unquote leader of Haiti was taken out today, Jovenel Moïse, the reason Duvalier couldn't be taken out is because he had the support of the people. What you must realize is that police, soldiers, those are just people, those are citizens, right? And in a place like Haiti, when you can't afford to pay them according to what they deserve, you're surely going to have a weak policing force that's prone to corruption. And the only thing that's going to keep them on your side is if they really believe. And he really had some believers. And he also knew how to manipulate international politics to bring in the aid that he could allocate to the people who were helping prop up his government. Now, I want to note that for Duvalier, following a history of French domination, 33 years of American occupation, and then following that, undue rule by the mulatto minority. And the funny thing about the mulattoes who were ruling Haiti is these were elites who spoke in French, not in Creole. And it's an important distinction to make because at that time, over 90% of the Haitians were noirs or black, and only 12 out of 100 Haitians could actually speak, read, and write French. Now ask yourself, if only 12% of the electorate could speak, read, and write in French, how can they vote? How can they vote when the ballots are in French, right? These are things you have to consider, but you're not going to hear a historical analysis of the current assassination on any of these news reporting agencies because they're trying to get the information out quickly and they're failing to speak to someone who's knowledgeable. Now check this out. This is what you should trip on. I'm just looking through this paper so I can give you meaningful information rather than just babbling, which is what you're seeing on the news right now. Oh, I have a meaningful quote for you too. There was a Haitian paper that wrote, "The country is without a government and on the verge of anarchy." That statement was written damn near 100 years ago. And it's been true ever since it was written, on the verge of anarchy. And that's what Haiti is going to continue to be on as long as we're pretending as though democracy is going to fit into the Haitian context today. It is not. You must have a strong leader or else you're going to have recurring assassination and revolution, which is what we've been seeing. Thomas Hobbes, a political philosopher, wrote, quote, "Equality as potential murderers places all men in the same insecurity from which arises the need for a state." By state, that means government. So what he's saying is that when everyone basically can be a killer and there's no government to stop people from killing, there's no government to jail murderers, then you're living in a situation where you're completely insecure and it's dangerous and unpleasant. That is what has been going on in Haiti, even with the president who was just recently murdered. And the reason he's not been able to properly take control of his country is because you have international organizations, Western organizations, that are saying that you violate human rights when you try to establish order. You know what? When there's no order, there are no human rights. And the reason I speak of Francois Duvalier is because he was one of the only people who ever succeeded in securing power in Haiti. Everyone else has had to rely on external forces, namely forces that are American-backed. Now, check this out. Here's a big fact for you. In the 126 years preceding Duvalier, meaning the 126 years, over a century before Duvalier, there were only 3 constitutional changes in power, which means that A guy finished a presidential term, there was an election, and then a new person came in as the new president. So there was only 3 times in 126 years that the Haitians were successful in transitioning power as a democracy. Now you might ask yourself, if it's 126 years, there's only been 3 successful transitions of power, what happened all the other times? Murder and assassination, which is why you should not be surprised at what's going on right now. Well, it looks like people are having issues with the stream. And this is weird because it's telling me that the stream is just fine. So it looks like the Google Corporation or somebody is trying to slow this down. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut it. We'll have to catch up soon.